The wind cut through the valley like a knife, carrying with it the scent of pine, wet earth, and the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys. Lila trudged along the narrow, rocky path that wound between jagged cliffs, her satchel slung over one shoulder, bouncing against her hip with each uneven step. She had no destination, only the instinct to move, to leave behind the home that had never truly been hers. Her parents had made it painfully clear, she was useless, a burden that had cost them more in worry and frustration than they were willing to bear. Their solution was merciless and final: sell her to the highest bidder, a stranger who might find her usefulness where they could not. They had not looked at her when they spoke the words. They had avoided her eyes, as if sparing her their gaze would make the rejection less cruel. But Lila had felt the full weight of their disdain, and though it threatened to crush her, something deep inside refused to break. She would not be broken. She would not vanish quietly into the night like some discarded tool. She would survive, and if the world had no place for her, she would carve one herself. Days blurred together. Lila moved through dense forests where sunlight barely reached the forest floor, learning to read the tracks of animals, to tell which berries were safe to eat and which would poison her. Her hands grew calloused from climbing over rocks and tearing bark to make firewood. Her feet bled, her stomach ached, and yet, with each night she spent under a blanket of stars, she felt a small, stubborn spark of pride. She was still alive, she was still herself. One late afternoon, as the sun slipped behind jagged mountain peaks and painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Lila stumbled into a small clearing. And there it was. A cabin, modest but strong, its walls of dark timber gleaming in the fading light. Smoke spiraled lazily from its stone chimney, carrying the faint smell of burning wood and cooked food. Her breath caught, and for a moment she forgot to move, mesmerized by the sight. It was more than shelter, it was proof that someone had managed to carve a life out of this harsh wilderness. A man emerged from behind the cabin, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of storm clouds and skin weathered by years under the sun. He carried an axe in one hand and a bundle of firewood in the other. His eyes, sharp and assessing, softened as they landed on her. There was no warmth at first, only the cautious curiosity of a man who had spent too long alone. "You're far from the village," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying easily over the wind. There was no accusation, no mockery, just observation. I have nowhere to go," Lila replied, her voice small, almost lost in the vastness around them. She clutched her satchel tighter, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. "Then come. You'll need shelter, and I have space." There was a quiet authority in his tone, but it was tempered by kindness. He set down the firewood and gestured toward the cabin. Inside. Now. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and iron from tools long used. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Lila sank onto a wooden chair, her body trembling from exhaustion, hunger, and the strange unfamiliarity of being welcomed rather than condemned. "Eat," the man said simply, placing a small loaf of bread and a cup of water on the table. "You'll need strength if you're going to survive out here." Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It felt strange to be spoken to without scorn, to be treated like a human being instead of a burden. "My name is Samuel," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "And you are?" "Lila," she murmured. He nodded as if committing the name to memory. There was a silence, but it was not awkward. It was the kind of silence that forms between two people who know that words are unnecessary for understanding. Days turned into weeks, and Lila began to see the rhythms of Samuel's life. He rose before dawn, chopping wood, tending a small garden, and hunting in the nearby forest. Every motion was purposeful, deliberate, and skilled. Lila found herself learning, too, how to track game, how to preserve food, how to build and repair. She was not useless here, she had a place, a role, and gradually, she felt a sense of worth she had never known in her family's home. Samuel watched her closely but never intrusively. Sometimes he offered guidance, sometimes he simply observed, letting her learn through trial and error. And slowly, between shared meals, quiet conversations, and long hours of work, a fragile bond began to form. One morning, after the snow had melted and the first wildflowers peeked through the thawing earth, Samuel handed her a small bundle of fresh herbs. His eyes were steady, serious, yet there was something soft there that made Lila's heart stutter. "I've built you a home," he said simply. "You're safe here, and I want you to stay with me as my wife." The word startled her. Wife. The concept felt foreign, frightening even, yet beneath it was a warmth she had never dared hope for. She looked at him, searching his face for mockery or cruelty, but found only honesty, only a quiet, unyielding sincerity. I don't know if I deserve that, she whispered, her voice trembling. You deserve more than they could ever give you, he replied softly. You've survived when others would have faltered. You're strong. You're needed. And I choose to need you. Tears pricked her eyes, but this time they were not of shame or sorrow. They were relief, a release from years of neglect, rejection, and loneliness. She stepped closer, drawn to the warmth in his gaze, to the promise in his words, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. The wind still howled outside, scattering leaves and bending the trees, but inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth and their hearts beat in quiet harmony. Lila realized that she had finally found a place where she belonged, a home built not of stone and timber alone, but of trust, care, and the fragile, precious beginnings of love. Samuel extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. In that small gesture was an unspoken promise, that she would never again be called useless, that she would never again be left to wander alone. Together, they faced the wilderness, not as master and servant, not as burden and benefactor, but as equals, bound by mutual respect and the tentative, exhilarating hope of a life reborn. And so, amidst the mountains and the whispering pines, Lila began to live again, not as the daughter they had discarded, not as a shadow of herself, but as a woman wanted, needed, and finally free.